Good morning, everyone. I am pleased to introduce three special guests for this panel. Before I do so, I just wanted to give a reminder. Please submit your questions through slide.do, and the code is DN2022. We have the pleasure of being joined by three past directors of Design Nation. Our first past director is Mihika Kapoor, who currently serves as a product manager at Figma, a software design company on a mission to make design accessible to everyone. She founded Design Nation in 2017. Alyssa Nguyen, is the owner and creative director of TN Design, a full-service branding studio specializing in women of color and LGBTQIA-owned businesses. She served as the director of Design Nation in 2020. Then we have Enver Ramadani, who is an operations associate at NEO, a startup accelerator and venture fund. It also serves as a mentorship community for undergraduate engineers. He was the director of Design Nation in 2019. My first question for all of you is, how did you become involved in Design Nation? And what aspect of the conference drew you in? Would love to start off with Mihika.
Thanks so much. Hey everyone, nice to see you all here. 6 years later, it's really incredible to see what the conference has become. So I actually founded Design Nation. It used to be called Designation, my junior year of college. For some context, like growing up, I had always been like big into visual arts and stuff like that, and when I was in college, that kind of transformed into a passion for design. And I sort of saw how design was changing so many different industries. There was sort of a watershed moment happening where people really recognized the value of good design and how important it was to be successful for a company. And so I saw this huge moment where design was shaping tech, consulting, like any industry, you name it. And yet I kind of felt like that wasn't really reflected in my own undergraduate curriculum, as I was a self-taught designer. And so, that summer I did a product design internship at Facebook, and I kind of heard from other students in my cohort that they actually faced a very similar problem, which was that they were self-taught. Their school didn't have the resources to give them to kind of help them really enter a career in design. And so that was sort of the incentive behind the conference, was how can we kind of identify top design-driven students across the country and connect them with creative design leaders to really give them an insight into how design is being used in industry across a variety of disciplines, and kind of hopefully inspire them to pursue careers in design. So that was kind of what really motivated me to start the conference, and I think it's been absolutely incredible to see how it has evolved since.
Yeah, would love to hear from you, Alyssa and Enver. Like, what really drew you into Design Nation? We can start with you, Alyssa.
Yeah, sure. So I actually joined Business Today, which is the parent organization for the conference, and I kind of found that I didn't fit in to the different niches that were in the organization. There are people who were in entrepreneurship, in finance, in banking. Everyone had their own separate groups, and I found that there wasn't a place for me until I realized that Design Nation had those people who had like more creative minds, despite Princeton not having a lot of designers. I'm like Mihika, I'm a self-taught designer, and so I really wanted to open myself up to more industry knowledge, and I really wanted to be a part of something on campus that allowed for me to merge this like new interest of mine that had no institutional backing. And at Princeton, this really is the only outlet if you're a designer. And I also think that I had done a lot of solitary activities at my time and during college, and I really wanted to open myself up to more collaborative work, and a conference with creative individuals from all across the country seemed like the perfect opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I came from a slightly different angle. The way I got involved was sort of two-pronged. I'd always been really interested in architecture. When I was in high school, I was convinced I was going to go into interior design, and I sort of quickly let that go. But I was always really interested in things that are equally technical as they are creative. And so that's when DN came into play. I staffed it the second year when Hansel directed. and I just fell in love with, and I think when you're going to take on a project like directing a conference, you really have to buy into the mission. And I bought into the mission, and I also bought into the ethos of the conference too, which is, I think, come as you are. It's like this sort of pseudo-corporate setup, right, of a conference, but people come in like dressed how they are, like let go of all stressors and expectations and are really willing to learn, which I think is very different than a lot of the other offerings that even business today has. So yeah, I mean, for me, like, DN was sort of how I got into design. Like I said, I was interested in architecture, and then like I started picking up sort of technical skills as I like learned things by, securing speakers for the conference and meeting students and assessing their portfolios. So it was sort of the start of my design journey, really.
Thank you so much. And I think what you said about the ethos of Design Nation, really making sure you buy into that ties perfectly into my next question. I want to hear a little, you all speak a little bit more to the theme that the conference had during your year. I know during the inaugural year, Mihika, that there wasn't necessarily a theme, but I want to hear about you just speak to what did you envision the inaugural year representing? I know you already kind of mentioned a little bit, but what did you imagine it to be, and then how did it turn out being, if you could talk about the differences there?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I originally kind of like set out to make Design Nation, I put together this like mega proposal. It was like 45 pages long. It was like, these are the students we're going to target. These are the speakers we're going to target. If they're not available, then them. If they're not available, then them, so on and so forth. And I think that there were a couple of threads that went through the whole thing. I think first was there was a pretty large focus the first year on how you can basically take design and apply it to any field. And so the student attendees, most of them were designers, but I would say not all of them actually identified as designer, because there was this sense of how can you take design and apply it to like very seemingly orthogonal fields, right? So how can you take design and apply it to like something like consulting or finance or tech? It fits in pretty naturally. But I think there was this like huge focus on how can we bring in design leaders from these like non-designy places and show how design is like so important there. So I think that was like a pretty overarching component of the first year. I think the second thing was there was like a pretty strong emphasis on technology. Just because I think that was one of the first industries to really embrace design and recognize the importance of like having designers there. And I think that when I envisioned the conference, one of the important things that went in, and as I was planning it out with the team, was really the importance of having a hands-on component, right? And so rather than just having a conference where you're kind of looking and sitting at staring at the stage all day, we basically wanted there to be hands-on workshops. So we had like IBM lead one, we had a like sketch tutorial. We wanted to basically be empowering students with the skills that they needed to go into industry and give them a taste of that. And so I would say like a combination of the skills, core skills, as well as giving people kind of a glance into how they could use design, even if they didn't think it possible, was really what motivated that.
Thank you. I really love hearing about like how students had something tangible to take away from the conference, as well as just getting that exposure, which is very important. Yeah, Alyssa, I would love to hear about your theme during your conference.
Yeah, sure. So mine was impact, and our slogan was design with an impact. And I honestly came up with that for a selfish reason. So a bit about me, which is irrelevant, but I was pre-med before I decided to drop everything and become a designer. And a lot of people, I think, struggle with entering creative fields who are in other fields before, because there's a stigma about the utility and like the prestige of being a creative, especially, I'm a first and second generation family, and so that was hard for me. And I think what I wanted to prove, or what I really wanted to emphasize, was that design is not purely an aesthetic or an accessory type of industry or way of thinking. It's something that's vital to our everyday lives, and like you can create impacts, whether it be socially or it's like economically, in so many different facets of ways with design and design thinking. And so I wanted to bring together a content list and speakers and people who really believed truly that design had an impact. And so all of the portfolios we were looking at and the applications and speakers we were looking at all were people with missions and had belief systems. Not just people who were good at what they were doing, but people who truly believed that there was an end goal or a purpose to what they were studying or doing with their lives. And I think that although it was unfortunate that COVID hit during my year, it was the perfect theme for that year because we were able to get these people together despite incredible tragedy and remember that there's an impact to even accommodating such events and an impact to just being together during that time. Yeah, and I really think that despite all the changes that we went through, it really reminded me and gave me a lot of insight for like my current career today.
Yeah, thank you. Enver?
Yeah, I think 2019 was the first year we decided to do a theme, and the theme was the first touch, which is basically like a nebulous term assigned to this idea of like, how can we bring in designers from, you know, sort of different disciplines of very different types of companies and ask them all to sort of speak about like how they approach that initial first step of design, right? And I'm sure all of you here have very, very different approaches to the type of design you do. Some people start with the research, some people sort of start with this idea brain dump, and some people like have a philosophy where like strictly design from first principles. And so the idea there was like, how can we have someone like, you know, Brian Bimschlegger from Arthur do a workshop on like the 6 thinking hats, which I'm sure a lot of you know about, like the famous De Bono paper, and also like have that stand with its own value and ask like Ario Jafarzadeh from Postmates X and about how they approach designing like a sidewalk robot for food delivery, right? So the idea that year was like, you know, just basically throw a bunch of content towards the audience on like, this is how some people who are at the top of their field are thinking about their work and the very first steps of their work. And so for me, it was less like, you know, design is, and I think for all of us, like design isn't one thing or the other. It's really like what you make of it yourself. So yeah, I guess that was sort of the approach for the theme that year.
I really appreciate the emphasis on design thinking and making sure that attendees had something to take away, which is here's how up-and-coming or even established designers are thinking. Here's how you can incorporate that into what you're currently doing. Thank you.
Yeah.
For my next question, I want to look at just the idea of taking away something from the conference and just making sure that as an up-and-coming designer, you're able to establish and really present yourself in the best manner so that you are able to make the most out of your Design Nation experience. So I would love to start off with you, Alyssa. What advice do you have for our attendees here who want to stand out as up-and-coming designers? If you could also just speak to your experience with your current brand right now, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I will, one, have to say, like, you are already here, so that speaks a lot to your ability to present yourself. But I think something that I've experienced with applying to agencies, starting my own, I think the biggest thing that you can do right now as a designer or as a creative is to create a center philosophy of like why you're doing what you're doing. I think it's easy to confuse what you do with like a job and the idea of being a professional and having to make salary and things, but look beyond all of that. And I really want to hear from my applicants whenever I look at applications and I'm speaking to other professionals, like what's your purpose? Like what is the underlying why? And that needs to show through your work. I need to see that in the things that you're doing. When I'm looking at a portfolio, for example, or when I'm even just speaking to someone casually, if it feels like there's kind of an aloofness about them, it really, like not in a rude way, it really doesn't make them stand out. I really like to hear that you are passionate about something, that you have a specific area you're like focusing on for a reason. As mentioned in my introduction, I specialize in women of color-owned businesses and LGBTQIA-owned businesses and marginalized communities for my work. The reason being is like I'm from that current background, and I also found in my experience at an Ivy League university that there's a lack of support for entrepreneurs in that area, and that's my why. Like everything that I do is for the reason of empowering those groups, whether it be the people that I connect with, the friends that I'm making, the work that I'm doing, even just like the research that I'm doing and the media I'm consuming. Everything has a purpose, And I think if the earlier you can find that, the better, and the more you can channel that in your work, the better your work becomes. It becomes so much more worthwhile and gratifying when everything you're doing really has like the center of gravity pulling it. And I think that whenever you're speaking to people, networking, if you can find out other people's whys, not just always think about what you believe in, I think that really creates a much more solid foundation for the future. So, an long-winded answer, basically, my advice, take it from the conference, is just like figure out what that is today, like really why you're here, why are you doing what you're doing, and then hear from other people, and then really push that forward in everything that you do.
I really love that, developing your why. Like, I think that's very, very important. Thank you. Mihika, would love to hear any advice that you have for attendees, like how they can stand out.
Yeah. First, like, huge +1 to what Alyssa just said. I think the why is like why this conference exists. So like when Design Nation was just an idea, I would like cold email a bunch of speakers, and they would hop on the phone with me, like really, really like high up design leaders, and they would get on the phone and they would say, oh my God, they would hear my story and they would say, oh my God, this was such a problem when I was in school. I can't believe it hasn't been solved as yet. And yes, I absolutely want to be involved and help. So like huge +1 to that. I would say the 2 additional things that I would encourage is like 1, be creative, and 2, be bold. Be creative is like right now, I think people are really celebrated for like going the extra mile, breaking the mold. If you're making your portfolio, make it stand out. If you're making, if you're doing a talk, if you're starting an organization, if you're building a company, like literally anything, just think about what can I do here to be different from everyone else. And I think that's what'll get people to notice you, is really like using your creativity. And I think that all of you are really blessed to have that creativity. And so you should really, really lean into it as a strength to distinguish yourself. And then the last thing in terms of being bold is like, as you pursue your dreams, along the way, people are going to tell you like, no, right? Like they're going to tell you like, if you're like applying for something, like, oh, it's not a fit right now. If you're like creating something, like, oh, that will never work. Like when I was making Design Nation, I got told so many times that like there was no proof that companies wanted to invest in design, and there was no way that this could be a self-sustaining conference, right? And I think that you just need to have so much conviction in your why, right? That you like really, really kind of just give your energy to the things that give you a lot of, that you're really passionate about, and really tap into those things to kind of like achieve your dreams. That sounds cheesy, but yeah.
Thank you so much. Enver, would love to hear what you have to add on.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys are going to take advice from anyone, like, take it from these 2. They're, like, badass women who, I mean, you guys don't know them personally, but, like, I've been in awe of them since I've met them, and +1 to all of their advice. The only thing I can add, really, is, like, be willing to get feedback and, like, seek it out. So many people don't do that basic step because they're afraid of, like, being criticized. And so to sum it up in, like, one little bullet point, like, be willing to get feedback and be willing to get reamed. Like, some people are gonna like tell you your work sucks. And you have to be able to like have the self-confidence to know when like someone's just being an asshole, and also like know when someone's criticism is valid and worth taking into consideration. Especially in like a creative field, right? Like there's such a blurred line between like an opinion that like is nebulous and like a concrete piece of feedback that like you should actually be taking. So like, you know, when you're finding this like this core philosophy or this gravity, and when, in the process of being bold and creative, like try to fine tune like how you respond to feedback, right? Because that's so important. Like you can be really creative and be static too, right? Because you're not forcing yourself to get better.
Yeah, no, I think that's very crucial, like making sure you understand the importance of feedback and then really incorporating it in the right way. Yeah, would love to just turn back to all of you and focus a little bit more about your careers. So each of you have all taken a very unique approach to your career and how that kind of is influenced by design. So would just love to hear you all speak a little bit more to how you use design in your career. And this can be as open as possible. So let's start with you, Mihika.
Yeah, so I work at Figma. Show of hands who's used Figma.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess you know how I use design in my job. But yeah, so I actually started out in Figma pretty recently, like 2 months ago. And I think that one of the things that really drew me towards Figma was I literally felt like it was me as a company. So for context, I even though I'm like really, really passionate about design, majored in computer science in college and minored in visual arts. And so I've always been this sort of like design, product, CS hybrid. And so I really felt like a strong connection between me and the company. But what I totally did not expect, that I was like so pleasantly surprised by upon getting to Figma, was that design doesn't just inform the product that we're building, but the way that we work. And so, you know, before, when I would make like product specs and things like that, it would be in like Google Docs or something, right? And it was this very kind of like staid kind of format to creating. And you know, sometimes I would work with designers. I would often work with designers, and I would always get really, really pixel deep on like, oh, we should try this, we should do this. And I was always told like, hey, you're a product manager, like that's for the designers, like stop. And I think at Figma, like all of that is very celebrated. So like you're encouraged to dive into the Figma file and do things yourself. We literally don't use anything except for FigJam and Figma to build our product. So like literally, if any of you have used FigJam, that's the product that I work on. It's like a whiteboard ideation tool. We make our Gantt charts in there. We do our like quarterly business reviews in there. We like really force ourselves to like really go visual first on everything. And I think something that's been so delightful is like everyone at the company is a maker in some way. And so everyone is sort of these like interdisciplinary hybrids. So software engineers are like making art on the side, and like finance people are like, you know, one person joined our company and had designed parks in the past. And so that creative energy like really infuses everything. And I think it's like really incredible. And I think that I want to like really encourage all of you to take those learnings and like bring creativity with you wherever you go.
That sounds so wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Enver, can you speak to your experience?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I'm not a designer by training, and I've sort of picked up skills in different design disciplines over the years. And you know, at my job, I have like the pleasure of working with like really early stage startups, and believe it or not, lots of like super tech focused startups do not buy into like the design first principle at all. And a lot of them are like, brand can come later. Like we don't need like a you know, what's the word, like a starting designer, right? The same way we need a first engineer. And so like I've been, you know, besides like working on the accelerator we recently launched, I've also been like on a rotation helping some of our portfolio companies with their messaging. And I think that's the thing I've always really loved about design, that it's not just like purely visual, but it's like in many cases it's a do or die between like a product reaching a consumer, right? And so I get to help them with their marketing and their brand design and their messaging. And it's really fun to work with people who like truly do not care enough about these things and like force them to care about it. So in some ways, you know, like I'm not designing in work, but I'm using a lot of principles that are very core and central to design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Love to hear about the way you really like force them to think about design,
yeah,
make sure
really
that that it's important and that they're actually utilizing it. Yeah, Alyssa, would love to hear you speak to this. I know it's more directly applied to your career, but if you could also just speak to like what your day-to-day looks like, that'd be very much appreciated.
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned before, I own a branding design studio or agency. We're full service, so we do branding, brand strategy. We also do all the collateral and development and websites and things like that. And I mostly work with consumer brands, D2C, a lot of like Gen Z and millennial targeted brands. And so my day-to-day is probably 80% designing, 20% running the business. So a lot of what I do is like client management. I do a lot of like the background finances and doing a lot of the strategy with it goes to marketing. A lot of what I do is marketing and strategizing my own brand's presence. So something to keep in mind, even as when I was a freelancer and a solopreneur, before I created an LLC, I had a brand to maintain on social media, also a brand to maintain within my portfolio, the way I presented myself, even on LinkedIn. I created branding for my LinkedIn page, which might seem overboard, but you know, it did get noticed, and you know, I made branding suites for everything that I did, so that way when people would see this lime green color, they knew it was me, or things like that. And so I'm always constantly working 20% like internal, and then 80% designing for other people. And you know, I'll like wake up probably around like 10 p.m. if I'm being honest, because I work from home and remotely. And I always start kind of with my intentions for the day. So I always plan like, am I working on the business today? Am I doing client work today? Am I pushing back on feedback? Like, what's my goal? And usually I find that I like to do all of the creative stuff after the business side has been done, because I find that it's kind of like biting the bullet. Like, I like the business stuff, but really getting all of inspired by your own business or your own stuff in the beginning makes you more excited, I think, to work on external things. And it really depends on what kind of work I do, depending on the project that I'm booking. So sometimes if I'm working on a physical product, then I'll spend the whole day on packaging. Sometimes I'm doing a new brand, I spend the whole day doing brand development, working on their brand strategy deck or working on their branding suite. Sometimes I'm in calls all day just presenting things and getting reamed, as Enver would say, and making notes to myself. And that's the exciting thing and reason why I chose to start my own agency rather than work someplace, is that I like the excitement of choosing what my day it consists of. I like the idea of flexibility, and if I get exhausted from doing websites, I can just stop booking websites for a whole quarter, which is within my right to do. I'm taking the whole month of May off because I'm going to Hawaii and I'm tired, you know, and that's within my right to do as well. And I think that's what's specific about what I do is I work with a lot of self-taught people. I work with a lot of internet entrepreneurs, which is really fun. And if you're interested in design, but you're not really sure if kind of like a more corporate or cohesive institution is for you, I would really highly recommend looking into what I do, which is running your own business or being a solopreneur, because my day-to-day is exciting and I love it.
Thank you. That was just so great to hear about. Would just love to return back to design as a concept. Want to hear about what you all really love about design, what draws you into just the field, the discipline, to the idea of design, and then who or what inspires you. So I'd love to return it back to you, Alyssa, to start off.
Yeah, sure. So I've always been a creative person, but art, I would say, as an abstract, expressive thing, isn't really my jam. I just found myself to be extremely mediocre at it, and you know, candidly. And but a big part of my brain really likes thinking of like reasonings and systems. That's why I love the business side of things, and design is really the merger of both sides of your brain, I find. I also like to have fun, but I also like to think. I think design is like the exact definition of those two things. So yeah, I think I've been into design for a long time. I just never really let myself believe it or really accept it because of the stigma around being creative. But yeah, I just love it, and now I'm addicted to it, and I do it all the time. But what inspires me, I would say, I actually don't like to draw inspiration from other designers or people in my specific industry, because I find that's really hard, you know, to get imposter syndrome. You start to compare yourself skill-wise, creativity-wise. So I try and draw inspiration from any other creative. So I really love interior designers. I love like florists. I love like cake decorators, photographers, anybody who's a creative that is completely irrelevant to what I do. I'm consuming their media all the time. Like, I'm really big into ceramicists these days. But I really try not to let myself take too much inspiration from people that I consider competitors or people that I might work with one day, because it's honestly pretty toxic to always be looking outside and not internally for that kind of thing. But when it comes to finding new ideas, thinking of new ways to approach problems, you can find that inspiration from literally anywhere else. Not saying that if you do that, that's bad, but I personally can't do that. So yeah, my Pinterest is all anything but graphic design these days.
I think that's really great advice, just looking elsewhere, looking everywhere for inspiration. Yes. Mihika, who or what inspires you?
Yeah, so My grandma likes to tell this story, and I don't know if it's true, but she insists that it is true, which is that when I was a baby, I would like cry, as babies do, and then you could walk me up to a painting, and I would stare at it and stop crying. And so I think I do get a lot of my inspiration just by like visuals, and like I went really deep in like fine arts, so like charcoal, soft pastel, acrylics, etc. growing up. And so I've always just been like very moved by like large scale fine art. So I think that's one thing. I think two is I'm very inspired by like young people doing creative things. I think like seeing my peers kind of like breaking the mold and doing things that are very different than what has been done before is really exciting. I think we're at this moment in time where if you look at the generation above us, there was a right way to do things. And if you look at the generation below us, there's like kind of a deviation from that. And so you guys are in a really great position to kind of, you know, not cross the T's and dot the I's, but create something more beautiful. And so I think that that's something that I find very moving. And then I think lastly is I get a lot of energy from like the intersection of design and technology. And so I think I've always kind of lived at this intersection. And so growing up for me, it was like math and science in school and art outside of school. And then when I was in college, it turned into like computer science and design. And so there's so much incredible innovation happening in the space. I don't know if you guys have recently seen like OpenAI's, yeah, I'm seeing like nods, like this incredible software that you can basically pass any like string of words. Like you can be like, oh, like an NFT dancing on top of the shed next to the vessel in the Baroque style, and it'll like create something for you. And I encourage you guys to look it up because it's so cool. But I think that just like that intersection, I think that there's like so much there and there's like so much to come. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. A lot to see there. Yeah, a lot of room for growth. Thank you. Enver, what inspires you about design, and then who do you look to for inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of mentioned this earlier. And both of you have sort of spoken about it, but I love anything that's sort of equally technical and creative. And I like stretching my brain in that way in terms of like where I look for inspiration. Honestly, anything at all that's like interdisciplinary. Like one example, Wayne McGregor, famous choreographer, who was working with Google's AI teams for a while to like generate movement, right? So they would sort of study the kinesiology of dancers and like basically like through machine learning algorithms, I'm not a CS person, basically like figure out a way, like I think the big question here is like, oh, like can you have a choreographer who after their life, like once they're dead, like still produce choreography? Like you've studied their movement vocabulary and you've studied the dancers' like physical limitations. Another example is like Casey Cadwallader, like artistic director or creative director of Mugler, who's like really inspired by like industrial materials and will like go to these like conferences in Germany where they like talk about like new fabrics and fibers and whatnot, and like incorporate that into his fashion designs, right? That are also asking questions about what it means to be a woman of the 21st century, right? What femininity means. And these things I think inspired me in my own work because it forces you to like flex your brain in a way that goes outside of the norm, right? So if you're like a CS person, there could be a very standard way in which you do your work. If you're a public policy nut, like there could be a very standard way in which you like process the news or understand policy. I think if you like look to people who are at the top of their fields, like you would be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't draw inspiration from like something so seemingly irrelevant to their field. And so my advice is basically like reiterating sort of what you guys said in a different way. Like look to things that like you're not even like interested in, because those things have like you can make lots of really unexpected connections about the things you're passionate about and the things that you know nothing about, right?
Yeah, no, thank you. Again, that's like a really salient point, looking for inspiration everywhere. Now I would love to open it up to you all, to our Q&A session. Please use the Slido link if you haven't already. Again, the code is DN2022.
Okay, so for the very first question, we have one from Maya.
Hi guys, thank you so much for this. It's been so insightful hearing from you guys. My name is Maya, and this question is for basically all of you. So what are the toughest problems or obstacles that you've faced or are currently facing as a designer, and how are you navigating those? Thank you.
Sure. I do a tiny bit of design. I'm not a designer. I do a tiny bit for my company because we're like a really small team. And I'll make some things on my own sometimes, just to like keep flexing those muscles. And I think the thing that is really hard. Are you saying like design as a general principle or like personally? Okay, cool. Well, actually, I think this ties to like general things I've been seeing in design too. I think like it's really easy to get like caught up on fads, and like I think it's become like more and more frequent where you see like a certain style of design is like super common, and everyone like hops on that train because it's like what's popular on social media and whatnot. And like I see it in my own stuff sometimes when I'm creating. I'm like, oh, is this derivative? Hate to use that word, but I think like something Alyssa was saying, which is like the only way to really combat that is like try not to consume too much like from people who are doing the same exact stuff as you. Like not necessarily the same exact stuff. But yeah, I think like that's one thing I've noticed. Like a lot of people like sort of just hop on a bandwagon, and like you sort of fall victim to that yourself when you're like taking in a lot of this stuff online. And so I think like the answer to that really is like step away from it and like try to create in a vacuum, and you can, or as much of a vacuum as possible. If that answers your question. Yeah.
Yeah, I can speak next to that. I think my biggest struggle has been more personal. I think, one, I'm a self-taught designer. I don't have a design degree. And that's been difficult to wrestle with, not in the sense that people doubt my skills, but I personally doubt my skills. And I think that probably applies if you have a design degree and if you have a bunch of accolades. I mean, I've been designing for almost 3 years now, and I still sometimes really doubt the validity of like my pricing. I doubt if I'm good enough for a client, if like I can produce the work and the caliber that they need. And I think that's a really valid struggle that you'll probably face throughout your creative careers. And my only advice or really solution that I found for that is rest, and especially creative rest. I've learned a huge lesson in that recently, actually. If you like, I mean, don't do it, but like on my Instagram, people who follow me like have followed my mental health journey. I've struggled a lot with burnout, especially because I started my business while I was in school, which I'm sure a lot of you maybe are probably trying to freelance while still in school and get a heads up on things. But the biggest thing that you can do is creative rest. And some people say creative rest as in like, oh, maybe I won't do a client project and I'll work on my Behance portfolio or make some stuff for Instagram. But the biggest thing that you can do when you're feeling overwhelmed and feeling that comparison and feeling the pressures of career, of success, the biggest thing you can do is really just not do anything related to your work. And that's kind of the biggest thing that I've learned, my biggest struggle. Recently, I've had the really amazing luck of getting to work with really cool companies. Like, I've worked with Adobe for a couple of months now, and I was on their insider list, and then I was in like Business Insider, and that was really exciting. But it made me feel very visible to the people that I knew and to people with regards to like success. And I felt like I couldn't falter, I couldn't be seen being weak or taking breaks during this moment of perceived success. And the biggest thing that I had to remember is that it's like no one knows what I'm going through, only I do, and so I have to do what's right for me. So I know it's hard as a creative, especially if you're trying to book things. You're always trying to like pander to your clients. You don't want to look unprofessional or weak for taking time off, but you're really not going to grow a sustainable career, especially as a creative thinker or like person, without that rest and without kind of like, you know, in a vacuum, sealing yourself off also emotionally. Don't think so much about what people perceive of you. Don't think so much about like how people are going to react to your breaks or to rest, because really it doesn't matter what they think. It matters like how you feel and how, you know, you're going to come out of it. So as someone who's taking a moment of rest, highly recommend it. It's great. And that's my biggest tip.
Thank you. Mihika?
Yeah. I think that one of the hardest parts of being a designer is similar to what Enver said earlier, and I hate that this is a thing, but it's that a lot of people still have yet to buy into the value of design. And so my first kind of 6 months out of college, so before I worked at Figma, I worked at Facebook. And my first team was a growth team, and growth teams are much more data-driven than design-driven. And it was a couple months in, and I pulled together this review, and I made it in Keynote, and it was beautiful, and like the review went like more or less pretty smoothly, and I put a lot of energy into making it beautiful because I cared about that. And afterwards, my director walks over to my desk, and he's like, you know, great review, you did a great job, just like one tip for next time. Don't make your slides so beautiful, otherwise people are gonna like doubt your content and think that you're trying to cover up for something. And I was like, what? I think that, you know, then later I switched to Instagram and they like pretty things, and so it worked out. But I remember just being like blown in that moment as to like how something that I thought was this like really strong kind of like core part of me was just being dismissed as something that was like trying to cover up for something else. And for what it's worth, I actually think I faced a lot of that when I founded this conference. And I would say that like founding this conference was like one of the most like challenging journeys of my life, because so many people said no, right? So like everyone who was not in design was like, there's no way this can work. Like there's no way that, you know, companies are gonna wanna like donate money for an all expenses paid design conference. They don't care enough about design. Design is not important enough. And then everyone in design was like, of course we want to be involved. Like, how can we be more involved? And I was like, what is this disconnect? And like, why can't people see past this barrier? And so I think that just like fighting against that like time and time again, and I'm sure like all of you either have seen that or will see that in your careers, and just knowing that like the more that you lean into that, the more that you can be an agent of change, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. What I'm really hearing is like perseverance and holding tight to what you really love is so important, and thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Let's move on to our next question.
So our next question will be from Oscar.
Hi. A lot of you talked about doing design as it is relevant to other things. So how have you communicated yourself as a generalist or having interdisciplinary skill and proving that as some kind of source of value when a lot of people try to box you into, you're a designer, you do this kind of work?
Mm-hmm. Lisa, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I think I'm a big social media person. Like, you know, I'm still Gen Z. And I think a big part of, not my allure, I'm not going to say that, but a big reason I think why social media has gone well for me is because I'm like unapologetically open about what I do, don't do, interested and not interested in. And I think I don't necessarily label myself in traditional ways if I don't want to. And I think social media can be really toxic, but it's also really a great tool for deciding your brand. So it's like I speak a lot about your personal brand, not just in a visual sense, but also like, do you want to infuse your personality into who you are? What I studied at Princeton was English literature, specifically multi-ethnic literature, and I infuse that in my work I got trained in copywriting, and I do socially awareness training for a lot of my brand owners. A lot of the copy I do is very racially sensitive, and I go beyond calling myself just a graphic designer now. Like, I am a brand strategist. Like, I build brands with racial and moral standards at the core. And when I tell people, they don't understand, and it's like, that's not my fault that you don't understand the depth of what I do. Sorry, that was really rude. And I've learned also when I like introduce myself to people, now that I moved to New York, like my first reaction is be like, oh, I'm a freelance graphic designer. But that's not what I do. And I tell people like, no, I run a branding design studio. People don't understand what that is. You can Google it after our conference. Yeah, and I think you just have to be steadfast in like the words you use to describe yourself, be really firm and resolute in the ways that you decide to present your work, who you are to the world, and then the people will adapt to that. No one questions now the terms that I call myself and how I describe my career because I don't question it. And that's really something I had to take me a long time to learn. Once you do learn that, it's incredible and very opening, and that box really dissolves over time.
Thank you. I love that confidence, by the way. Enver?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I'm still trying to figure out for myself. I think like the general advice, and a lot of you probably heard this when you were applying to college, like, oh, like be good at everything but have a spike. And I'm very lucky in that my boss is like super invested in my career development, like at my company and also beyond. And he like sat me down one day. He's like, so Enver, what do you want to do? Like, what do you want to do in 5 years? I'm like, I don't know. Like, I kind of like this generalist thing I'm doing where, like, 1 week I work on, like, our recruiting efforts, another week I'm helping with the accelerator events. Like, and he's like, yes, that's good, but you should find something. And I think, like, it's still, like, he's a brilliant man, and, like, I'm trying to buy into that, too, and trying to, like, you know, work on having that one thing I'm really good at, but also, like, trying to blur the line a bit between that and, like, what Alyssa's saying, where, like, you can, if there isn't a title out there that exists for what you want to be, make it, right? And ties back to what Mihika was saying, where like, if you really believe in yourself as like this sort of generalist or multidisciplinary type of creative person, whatever you want to call it, then like go full force with it, right? I think like I'm a huge believer in the fact that like being a jack of all trades, so to speak, is like really, really valuable. And you know, Jack compared to king, like you could be the king of all trades too. Like if you just really like doing a little bit of everything, I think like the way you communicate, the way you communicate yourself is basically being like, I'm formidable, I'm very flexible, and I can learn things like as they come my way. So yeah, I mean like that's sort of not a really concise answer. But yeah, I really liked what Alyssa was sort of alluding to, where like if you're interested in a lot of things, like make the title for yourself, right? Like chart your own course.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, I honestly think they covered it. I think it's all in how you tell your story. I think that like you are the first person to put a label in yourself and like what you put on your resume, how you introduce yourself to someone, and it's your choice whether you say I am a designer or like, I don't know, I started saying like I am a product design CS hybrid because like that's who I am, and I think that that's what people should know about me. Mm-hmm. And so I think that just being very intentional about how you tell your story is important, and also like anything that's, you know, that you feel is an important part of your identity, like don't gloss over that, like talk about that. And I feel like when I was younger, what I would do when I would like introduce myself to someone is just kind of talk about what I was doing right now. And I think over time, like what I've learned is like, no, you should talk about all the things that are like seemingly irrelevant that like inform what you do now, because that's how people understand you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so our next question is going to be from Love. I'm not sure. Every time I'm going to ask a question, I have to do that. My question is actually going to be for Alyssa. I wanted to test that your social media presence is actually working, because the algorithm like pointed me towards you maybe like a year or two ago, and I followed you. So props to that.
Oh my God.
On that note, I obviously noticed like your personal branding really impacts the way that your social media leads to your followers. So I was wondering, because personally, like I think it's very difficult to establish like personal branding, how you kind of ventured through that and advice that you might have, in terms of that.
Yeah, sure. So this is something that I think works for like brands in general and also for personal branding, is I like to try and find inspiration from words. And I think of like if I were to be described by different people in different relationships to me, what words would be unanimous among those things? So my mom, how would you describe me? My cousin, who's here, my friends, coworkers, clients, what words would they use to describe me energy-wise, or what words would I like to be described as if you don't know what that is yet? And some of the words that came across, like I would like to be considered fun, but I also wanted to be considered somewhat like relatable or like comforting in terms of presence, friendly. And then I thought about what those words mean in terms of messaging and brand voice. Then how do those terms manifest visually? Like what colors, what fonts could really communicate comfort but also fun? And think about content-wise, like when you're thinking of your portfolio, what brands would work with a fun and comforting designer? And also what types of animations or types of videos am I making on TikTok? And the type of energy that I'm presenting myself in those videos all need to tie back to those key experiential adjectives that I came up with for myself. And those things can change over time. Like as I mature, maybe I don't want to be perceived as fun anymore. I mean, maybe I will. But, and those things can change. And as those things change and adapt, that's how you can tweak the collateral that is then derived from it. But everything that I do is really focused towards perpetuating those core adjectives that I made for myself. And I like the reason why I choose them or have other people choose them is because like self-perception and also like outside perception are different. And so you can choose ones that seem authentic to yourself and also choose ones that are aspirational and combine them and then work from there outwards. And that's how I do all my branding work as well. Like my clients and I, we choose key adjectives and experiential words that they want their clients to see and that they themselves want to feel. And then I build outwards visually and strategy-wise. And I think it works really well.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have a question from Rifa.
Hi, my name is Rifa. Thank you so much for your insights. I've been rigorously taking notes. I've just learned so much already in the first hour of day 2. But my question is specifically for Enver, and I guess anyone really. I am a part of an organization back on campus that does pro bono consulting and like design strategy for early stage startups, or actually, it's like an accelerator program. And often we run into founders who also don't believe in this design-first approach. And so I was wondering, how do you start that conversation with these early-stage startups and even Mihika, like running into, I guess, like the threshold of convincing others to just value design? How do you start that conversation?
Yeah, well, if Mihika doesn't mind, I actually want to defer to her first because I think she probably has a really good answer to this.
Oh boy. So, let me think. Okay, so I think that you have to start by figuring out like what they need that's relevant to design. So there is like a baseline of design that any company needs, right? So like a logo, right? Like every company needs a logo. Every company needs to like think about like what is their name and how does that like embody their identity and how does that communicate to other people what they are or are not or want to be. And so I think you kind of like start out the conversation with like logos, websites, etc. because yeah, there's this like baseline there. And then I think there's ideally a way to like transition the conversation into like how important design is to succeed today. And so if you look at most companies like that are thriving, they have incredible design because at some point you realize that in order to win, you need good design, right? And so Figma has this like really great stat in our onboarding, which was like IBM went from like a 1 to like 200 and something designer to non-designer ratio to like 1 to 6. And it's like, that goes to show how like even like highly technical companies or like older school companies or whatever, like really, really need design to stay with the times. So that's like 1. I think 2 is encouraging companies to like up-level their definition of design. I think a lot of people associate design with like just visuals. But really what design is like inherently and like very deeply understanding your user and then building your product to address those users' needs, right? And I think that the companies that often fail are companies that like think that they know best, like think that they know more than their users and just kind of like block out their users. And so, yeah, I would say like in summary, there are like two ways to bring in design. One is like just really working with them on like, yeah, first logo, then website, then user interface, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then two is like really having design be like a governing ethos of how they build. And I think that like one potential roadblock here is that a lot of startups, I would say like the more common case today, and I don't know, Enver, if you've seen this, but like I kind of like angel invest and advise startups on the side and stuff like that. And I feel like a more common case that I see is like they recognize that they need design, but like they don't want to deal with it. So they're like, oh, like I need to hire a contractor to like do all my design. And you're like, okay, but what? And they're like, no, they just have to like do everything. And I think that like understanding that like the approach to design is like collaborative, has to be like heavily motivated by and driven by the founders who are crafting their identity and things like that, and really understanding that it's kind of like a melding of the minds is super important.
Yeah, I mean, all of that. I think like one thing Mihika alluded to that I think I'm learning, like I graduated last year and I'm learning this as I like move forward in the workforce, is you can't just throw ideas out there in a vacuum and expect like a yes or no response. I think if there is an approach towards something that you want to take, in this case, if you want to like get startups on board with like implementing design into their infrastructure or whatever it is that you guys do, like show them that it works, right? And so I've sort of stopped being like, oh, like, what do you think about this idea? I'm like, no, I'm going to do it, show you that it works, and then you can tell me if you like it or don't like it. I think like at some point you hit a wall, right? Like some people are just never gonna sip the Kool-Aid we all have. But some people I think just like need to see the proof, right? And you know, the super successful companies are one type of proof, but also showing them like whatever ideas it is you're recommending, and we can talk like off stage more if you want. But like showing them that it works, not just telling them, right? Whatever that looks like.
Thank you. For our last question, I want to pivot back to Design Nation. Just rapid fire. Would love to hear you all share your favorite memory from your conference. We can start with Alyssa.
Yeah, sure. So my favorite memory is actually like, being a staffer at your conference.
Sick.
But we just had a networking hour, just an hour just to chat. I have never felt less like alone, I think, in my life, because we talked about everything from trying to find internships to, you know, not really knowing like what to call ourselves to like, you know, oh, I thought my resume was ugly, I can't believe I'm here type of stuff. So I would take, you know, advantage of the people sitting next to you, and also if you can like pull execs aside and like just chat to them, like honestly best memories of like that year for me. And I still talk to the people that I met when I was staffing to this day. Some of them I actually have hired recently.
Awesome.
You know, plug. So.
Enver?
Yeah, I kid you not, I think I was telling you this earlier, I literally from the moment that conference started to the moment it ended, like, blacked out. I was like in the back, just like flashing fingers for like 4 minutes off stage. But in the heat of that madness, I would say like, meeting the attendees was so much fun. Like I literally grabbed dinner with one of the attendees from my year like a few weeks ago. And she's like thinking of starting her own company, and we were just sort of like spitballing ideas. And just like following the attendees from my year, and like, you know, like we don't talk super often, but like seeing what they all do with design, like some of them really use it as just like an expressive medium to talk about, like, there's this one guy who like talks about being queer and from India and like exploring gender. And that's like what design does for him. And seeing how other people, like this girl Zainab, who I was talking about, how for her, like she really thinks of herself as CS first, and design is just sort of like a, you know, it's like taking your vitamins. It's like a supplement that just sort of helps you think in a different way. So I think like meeting really cool people, like I know we're on sort of the opposite side of like the conference, like the organizers and the attendees, but at least I feel like I speak for all of us when I say like reading through applicants' resumes and profiles. I'm like, these people are so sick and like way cooler than I will ever be. So yeah, I would say like putting faces to the resumes and the portfolios was really my favorite part.
Thank you. Mihika?
Yeah, I'm gonna cheat and give like a bunch of memories. But there was like I'll give like a before, during, and after the conference. So before the conference, like the first year of the conference, it looked pretty, but behind the scenes was so janky. We literally we wanted to like have the branding be a very, very big part of it, and so we like laser cut out these like giant DNs. They were like this big, okay, like 4 of them, and then spray painted them in Princeton's stairwells. Like it was really, really janky. And so like stuff like that, we would like go into like the laser cutter lab and like make these like DNs, and I still have them on my desk right now. We have mini ones and we have like giant ones and like stuff like that. Like just like everyone coming together to be like really, really scrappy, I think was just like really magical. I think day of the conference, there was definitely this like, wow, I can't believe this is happening moment. Yes. And I was on this like weird high because I had slept for 2 hours the night before. And you know when you like don't sleep, but you're like responsible for the whole day, you're like in this like 2 frames of mind where you're like, you can't even think about being tired. And so you're just like bouncing around all the time. And I think like seeing the attendees meet each other, and seeing like people really, really get value from like the conversations they were having, being so engaged in the seminars, so like hands-on in the workshops. I think that was just like a beautiful moment. And then like the after the conference was like, I literally had people like tell me that like I changed their lives with the conference, and that was so meaningful, like to go on and see people who like went up to speakers afterwards and then joined the companies that they worked at, or people who, you know, sparked friendships that turned into collaborations. And so I just like really want to emphasize the advice that Alyssa and Enver gave, which is like, talk to each other, talk to the speakers, like make connections, form a community, because I really think that's the best part. And just like going on and seeing attendees like thrive. Like there was one girl who designed like Cardi B's album last year. And I was like, what? Like literally like the people around you, like all of you are so cool and are surrounded by so many cool people. And I think that that's just like really the magic here. So, you know, take advantage.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for your wonderful advice. Just really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and speak to us. And thank you all for your wonderful questions.
Sorry.